Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grimflayer. Hope you're all doing very well today, and that is right. If you haven't heard it before, you're hearing it now. Bridge from Below is officially banned in the modern format. Bye-bye, Bridge. And that's it, no other changes. So we are going to have a brief conversation here today about why they banned this card, what we as BG Rock players can expect the meta to look like in the wake of its banning, and which cards in our deck have gotten better due to this banning or have gotten worse. So we're going to talk about that, and hope you'll stay with me as we do so. Remember, my friends, if you are enjoying this content, if you find it valuable, if you find it entertaining, patreon.com/GrimflayerMTG. Link is in the description below. We do have 3 new Patreon supporters this week, and thank you to Steven with a V, Steven with a P, and Frank. We'll do full introductions for these fine gentlemen in the next gameplay video, as is customary, but didn't want to let too many videos go by without mentioning you. So thanks to Patreon supporters one and all, and now let's talk about this ban. Alright, my friends, so one thing I forgot to mention in my opening spiel is that I've actually moved my computer. Moved the computer to a new room. It's the coolest room in the house before I was in the hottest room in the house, so big quality of life improvement for the Grimflayer, but let me know if the sound is any different for you. I hope it's just as good, if not better, but you'll have to let me know about that. But regardless, we're in a cooler climb, which is really nice. So anyway, having said that, here's the ban announcement. I won't read the whole thing, but I do want to read the kind of a TLDR version here from our data gathered through Magic Online. This deck is shown to have a high overall win rate, fast wins, and few unfavorable matches. It has warped the metagame around itself, forcing other decks to adopt especially high numbers of anti-graveyard cards to keep pace. And of course you can read the whole announcement for yourself, the whole thing's here, but that's really the salient point. And we as BGX players know full well that this last sentence, this last phrase, I guess, is especially true. High numbers of anti-graveyard cards. There's no question about that. And, so this is kind of a blessing and a curse, because on the one hand, if there's one clear deck to be gunning for, it does allow us to structure our deck accordingly. And as a deck that needs the right answers at the right times, that is valuable. On the other hand, it strains the slots in our sideboard to the max. And so, a little bit of a double-edged sword. But that's, I have no qualm with any of the reasoning they give here. I think all that's correct as far as I can tell, and as far as their data shows as well. So, fair enough, Wizards. But one thing that is worth mentioning is that there was no discussion in that announcement I just showed you of this card, of this innocuous common called Faithless Looting. There's no discussion of looting. It's not on the radar that they have said. It is not something that they're monitoring that we know of, really. So, what does that mean? Well, that means that Faithless Looting, if I had to guess now, if I had to make a long-term projection now based on this, Faithless Looting is here to stay. Faithless Looting is seen as a staple of the modern format. And, that's going to divide a lot of opinions. A lot of people think that's great. A lot of people hate that. It's hard to tell what Wizards thinks of it, but, if they don't mention it whatsoever in this rundown that they gave us here, then that is what I am forced to conclude. Now, that could be wrong. Maybe they just don't want to kind of scare people too much. Like, if they ban Bridge from Below, which does kind of nuke the Hogak deck from Orbit, and they're saying Faithless Looting is on the edge, maybe that makes people a little bit more frightened to invest in Modern, or it makes them a little bit more skittish about their looting decks. Who knows? So maybe there are other reasons, and maybe they are behind the scenes monitoring looting. I certainly don't know, but it is worth just mentioning that there's no mention of this card itself in the banned and restricted announcement. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is what the meta is going to look like in the wake of the Hogak ban. So, of course, it's been at the top. This number is actually probably low, but, a minimum 9% of the meta. It's definitely got to be higher than that, though, in the recent past. And so some people have said, or some people have asked me, hey, do we need to play as much Grave Hate anymore? I would say yes, and here is why. So, number one, is it Phoenix? This deck has been at the very top of the meta since its inception. It is the number 2 deck in the meta even coexisting alongside Hogak. Now, granted, I understand that it has a pretty good matchup and all that stuff, but still, you know, there's so much graveyard hate flying around, and Phoenix is still the number 2 deck in the format despite that, despite them taking a lot of collateral damage from that. Now, Phoenix is not going anywhere. That I can tell you, that I can predict with utmost confidence. Phoenix is not going anywhere, and therefore that is one big incentive to keep graveyard hate in. The other big incentive is down here a little bit further in the meta, Dredge. So Dredge has most directly of any deck, has been the one that has been displaced most directly by the Hogak deck, and now that Hogak is gone, I fully expect Dredge to surge back up to the top, because not only is it going to be the premier all-in graveyard strategy to play in the wake of the Hogvine ban, it is also, if you recall, before Modern Horizons came out, Dredge and Phoenix were both in the top 5, if not the top 3 decks in the meta. So, to me, it's not like we got any, really OP new graveyard hate cards in Modern Horizons or in Core 20. We just got some reprints, which is maybe helpful for some, but we don't have new graveyard hate suddenly making Dredge a terrible choice. So in the wake of the Hogak Bridgevine ban, I fully expect Dredge to come all the way back up to the very top tables. So that hopefully answers the question of, do we still need to play graveyard hate? I would say yes. Now, the composition of our graveyard hate will change, and I'll get into that later. And maybe we can tone down on it a little bit. Certainly the main decking Spellbomb is not as good as it was with Hogak everywhere, but yeah, we still need a good amount of graveyard hate. I wish we didn't, I wish we could just ignore that archetype and just tech for other things. We'd be really good against those other things, but sadly that's not the case. So that's the answer to that question about graveyard hate. Now I do want to touch on a couple other expected meta changes, and of course this is just my prognostication, could be wrong, but here's what I'm thinking. So this Eldrazi deck, oh boy, I have been doing horribly against Eldrazi. My win rate overall is I think like 63% in modern leagues online since Modern Horizons 1, and I'm like 0-4 against Eldrazi. I'm like 0-3 against the colorless Eldrazi Stompy decks, so this is my boogeyman right now, and I truly hope that it will fall off in the meta, and it's not just a vain hope. I think there's actually reason to expect that it will. Chalice of the Void. Eldrazi viability and power in the meta is to a significant degree dependent on how good Chalice of the Void is, and if Hogak Vine goes by the wayside, that's a big reason that Chalice is no longer that great. Chalice seems to be a lot worse against Dredge than it is against Hogak. I'm no expert on any of these decks, but that is my read on the situation. And you also have to imagine that Eldrazi has eaten into the meta share of traditional mono green Tron to at least some degree. And with Hogak gone, I expect Green Tron to make a resurgence. Now, some of you might be thinking, why is that a good thing? Well, I don't know. My win rate against Tron is actually pretty high. So I think that traditional Tron, with a traditional or stock current rock sideboard, is actually a better matchup than most of the Eldrazi variants. Maybe Eldrazi in Taxes is a little bit more beatable, but like the Stompy decks, the Eldrazi Tron decks, those are all nightmares. I never want to see those. So if Green Tron comes back up to where it used to be, number 3, number 4 in the meta, while that's not good for us per se, I think it's better than having Eldrazi Tron that high. And notice how well positioned Jund is right now with all the new tech from Horizons. And notice the resurgence of Mardu Pyromancer. So a shoot back to the top for Mono Green Tron would solidify BG Rock as perhaps still the mid-range deck of choice, simply because it lines up so much better against Mono Green Tron than any other mid-range deck that's in the top tiers out there. So if that change happens, and I do expect it will to at least some degree, I think that will be a good thing for us. I think Phoenix is a great matchup for us as it is. It's far from a free win or anything. The deck's hyper consistent, but we line up really, really well against it overall. I think the Humans deck will stay up near the top, and I think our matchup there is totally fine. Especially if you're heavy on Plague Engineer, it's probably better than totally fine. It might even become good post-side with many, many Plague Men to call into action. And I won't go too far down this rabbit hole of anticipating the meta. There's just a million moving pieces. We might have other Horizons tech that's been suppressed by the dominance of Hogak coming up, and who knows what's going to happen. But the final thing I'll say is I'll mention Blue-White Control. So Blue-White Control seems to match up very, very well against Hogak Vine, which is part of why it's as prominent in the meta as it's been. And of course, our matchup against Blue-White Control is not good. So if Blue-White Control suffers a little bit of collateral damage from Hogak going by the wayside, because number one, they don't have a really good matchup up top anymore at the very top of the meta, and number two, the top tables are more diverse than they used to be, so it's harder for Blue-White to tech appropriately. Yeah, that's going to be a good thing for us. So hopefully, just to sum up this section of the video, number one, yes, Phoenix is still around, Dredge is coming back, and we still need to play a good amount of Grave Hate. Number two, hopefully Eldrazi Tron will fall off, and even if that means Mono Green Tron will take its place, that is totally fine. Number three, other decks like Humans, they're kind of neither here nor there relative to the ban. Those matchups are what they are, nothing much changes there. And number four, hopefully Blue-White Control will fall off at least a little bit as well. Okay, so now we are going to talk about which cards have gotten better in the wake of the Hogak ban from our deck, and you can't go wrong by starting off with mentioning Scavenging Ooze. Now, it's kind of ironic, right? Because we had this key piece from an all-in graveyard deck get banned, and suddenly our main deckable graveyard hate gets better. How does that work? Well, here's how that works. Scavenging Ooze is just not usually sufficient to slow down and eventually take over the game against this Bridge from Below Hogak deck. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of the wins that I've achieved against that deck were turn 1 discard into turn 2 scoos. It's still a very, very live play in the matchup, but that line, without any harder graveyard hate supplementing it, just simply does not beat the Hogak, the really strong Hogak starts. It's just not enough. Whereas it is enough more often against Dredge. It is sometimes enough against Phoenix, although the Phoenix deck attacks on multiple angles, so it's not, it's a little more high variance in that matchup, let's say. But the point is that the graveyard decks that we're going to see now are a little bit slower and a lot less resilient to soft hate, like the type of hate that Scoos brings. So I think Scoos' stock rises. I think you should definitely be back on 3 Scoos now if you were not already. And maybe you should have been on 3 already, but I myself experimented with going down to 2, partially to make room for harder hate in the main deck like Nile Spellbombs. So I don't think the need for the Spellbombs main deck is as great as it used to be. It's still a viable thing to do, but I would rather just go back to the core creature count of 3 Scavenging Ooze alongside your 4 Bobs and your 4 Glyphs and whatever else you're playing. So Scoos' stock has risen. And in a similar vein, the stock of Kalitas Trader of Get has risen. Now, I don't know. Kalitas is not currently in my 75. I don't know if I'm going to bring him back. He's more of a borderline card than he used to be, especially if you are playing with Unearth. He cannot be Unearthed. That's a strike against him. Many of us have pivoted to a 23 land build, which is another strike against playing a 4-drop. He's just not as free of an inclusion as he used to be. However, he is a way, way more realistic way to take over the game and eventually win it against Dredge than he ever was against Hogak. So, if, again, we're kind of expecting Dredge to take up a lot of Hogak's old meta share, Kalitas definitely gets better. So for those of you who are already, play Kalitas through thick and thin, congratulations, he just got better. For those of you who are more on the fence about him at the moment, given other recent changes to our deck, he, I think, becomes more playable, and you'll have to figure out whether that's right for you. I still need to work on my list post-ban, so we'll see. But I'm more inclined to play him now than I was yesterday. The next card whose stock has risen is Surgical Extraction. So kind of like the other cards we've just mentioned, Surgical is very, very good in general against graveyard decks. but was also usually not sufficient against Hogak. Against Hogak, you frankly just needed to clear out the entire graveyard a disproportionate amount of the time. If they're at all going off, you need to totally wipe the graveyard. Extracting a key piece is often not quite enough. So that's definitely one reason why Surgical stock has risen, because it is more likely to be sufficient in its own right against Dredge. You know, we play our interactive game, we maybe discard a key spell, we play a Tarmogoyf, and then we extract a key piece that hits the graveyard. That's enough to keep us in the game. Whereas against the Hogak deck, yeah, maybe not so much. The other thing is, if I'm correct, that Eldrazi Tron falls away and is supplanted to some degree by Mono Green Tron. Well, we all know how good this card is against Mono Green Tron. Ideal use case is you pop an Urza's Land with that Fulminator Mage, you wait till the draw step, you extract all copies of that Urza's Land, and there you go, you're never facing the Tron lands fully assembled for the entire game. But of course, that pairs well with Field of Ruin in just the same way. And even if the games go long against Tron, and they already have, 5, 6, 7 lands on the field, well, then it's time that Surgical becomes a way to extract 4 copies of a big Haymaker threat that's really good against us, like Karn Liberated, or Wormcoil Engine, or whatever the most opportune high-count target is. So Surgical does, in my view, get better for sure in the wake of this ban. And the final card that I'll mention along these lines is Grafdigger's Cage. Now, Cage's stock had fallen for a couple reasons, but the most important reason it's fallen recently is that it just wasn't that good against Hogak. It doesn't shut down a few different parts of their deck. It only shuts down kind of, part of their engine, basically. But against a deck like Dredge, Grafdigger's Cage is a lot more effective. Now, don't get me wrong. It's still, I think, overall a little bit worse than the other cards we've mentioned, like Spellbomb and Surgical, because, number one, if they remove the cage, you have not taken anything out of their graveyard. They don't have to spend any resources to rebuild. They just get to go off as soon as they kill the cage. And number two, Dredge at least was more likely to play cards like Blast Zone, and, they just have more answers around to a card like Cage. I don't know what their lists are going to look like in the wake of this ban. I really don't. But so Cage's stock had fallen a little bit for a variety of reasons, but it's back up now because, again, if Dredge and Phoenix are more of the graveyard decks to beat, then Cage is a heck of a lot better there than it was against Hogak. And here's one other, piece of the puzzle, kind of unrelated, but worth mentioning here. This deck right here, Neobrand. It's not that high in the meta right now, but there is a lot of talk about it, and there is some level of expectation that the London Mulligan will make this deck into a real force to be reckoned with, because it's just got the fastest combo kill potential in Modern. Now, you could argue that the decks like Neobrand, like Devoted Druid that we see here, they don't have to race Hogak anymore, so maybe they're not as good as they used to be. So the argument cuts both ways, but the point is that Grafdigger's Cage's stock has risen a little bit against the graveyard decks, and if Neobrand really takes off and becomes a bigger percentage of the meta, then Grafdigger's Cage is very good there too. And next up, we will talk about the cards in our archetype whose stock has fallen, and you can't get away from this one. This is the most obvious example, Leyline of the Void. This card's stock has cratered in the wake of the Hogak ban. Now, Leyline of the Void is great graveyard hate. There's no getting around that. It comes down turn 0, that's awesome. And hey, you know what? There is some synergy with a deck like ours that likes to be, it plays traditionally along the curve. It makes turn 1 discard really good because you can take an enabler, or you can take a payoff, and either way it's going to get exiled, right? So, there's a lot to like about Leyline of the Void, but the big problem is that it's a terrible top deck, and it incentivizes us to mulligan really heavily in search of it, two things that our deck does not want to do. So Leyline of the Void is, generally speaking, it's a useful metric to say that a card like this, the Leylines in general, are better in combo decks than they are in fair mid-range interactive decks. So, if they didn't ban anything today out of Hogak, would I have eventually pivoted to Leyline? Well, maybe. I certainly would have given it a good run out. but I would not have been happy about it. I would have considered it a necessary evil, rather than like, yeah, this card slots beautifully into our archetype, this does everything I want it to do. It really doesn't. So this card stock has fallen, and I really don't recommend playing it in BG Rock. You know, except maybe, just maybe, if you're in a really graveyard-infested local meta that you know it's safe to tech for with ley lines. But even then, you know, maybe it's better to just play more and more copies of Surgical and Spellbomb and Cage. You know, that might still just be better because they just complement our core game plan so much better, in my view. So leyline stock has fallen. Good news for those who don't want to buy a playset. Now you probably don't have to for the Rock. And next up, Yixlid Jailer. This card stock has definitely fallen. So I've seen some people saying, oh, this card's awesome, why weren't we playing it before? It's really, really cool, and I agree with the latter point. It is a super cool card. Hey, it's another Future Sight one, just like Bridge from Below. But here's the thing. You have to remember that before the Hogak Summer took root, Yixlid Jailer saw like no modern play. It was, at most, kind of a fringe playable, probably seen less often than not, like one of tutor target in a toolbox creature deck, right? Like maybe a Traverse deck or a Court of Calling toolbox, you know, creature deck that plays some element of Hate Bears. Yeah, sure. Sometimes, and I do emphasize sometimes, you would see a one of Yixlid Jailer. That's really it. So people are saying, is this card still going to be good if Hogak gets banned? And the answer is pretty clearly no. You know, when a deck is an outlier like Hogak was, you gotta do what you gotta do. If you're slamming 3 Yixlid Jailers in your sideboard to beat the Hogak deck, then hey, more power to you. I think that's totally fine. But now things are kind of back to normal, and Yixlid Jailer, it is just an awkward card. It dies to a stiff breeze. And this one very simple line of rules text is not as simple as it looks, and it's also not as powerful as it looks. It has to do with the layering rules in Magic. If you're not familiar with those, you can look them up, and you can look up what that means in reference to Yixlid Jailer. I won't get into it here because I don't think we should be playing the card at all anymore, if you even were in the first place. But suffice to say, the card, its stock has fallen. Its stock has fallen. No longer preys upon the Hogvine deck. And the final card whose stock has fallen is a Ravenous Trap, and any other, you know, really unusual cards that you don't often see in Rock decks historically, but maybe you've seen once or twice since Hogak took over the format, can be put in this category as well. And, you know, Ravenous Trap is a sweet card. The traps in general are pretty cool design. There's the if clause, and if the if clause is fulfilled, you pay 0, and boom. It exiles all cards from their graveyard, and hey, it's even one-sided hate, which is just what we like. It's why we play Nihil Spellbomb over, like, Relic of Progenitus in the first place, because we want to keep our graveyard around, we just want to hose theirs. So, Ravenous Trap does fill a fine role, it's a fine card, but it is pretty clearly, in my view, outclassed by cards like Nihil Spellbomb and the other ones we've mentioned. To me, Ravenous Trap is for really polarized metagames, like the one we saw here, where, like the Hogak deck, again, it's resilient to Surgical, it's resilient to Skoos, you just need to play as many cards that totally wipe out the graveyard as you can, and or it's a way for decks that don't have access to good Grave Hate in their colors, and for whatever reason are not that high on, like, Tormod's Crypt or Relic of Progenitus, or maybe this is a competitor card to those. Sure, Ravenous Trap is a fine role player, but in the green-black colors, when cards like Spellbomb and Ooze work so well along our value plan, as well as being good enough graveyard hate to keep up with the strongest graveyard decks, I don't think we really want Ravenous Trap in our 75s at all, if you were playing with it in the first place. And finally, my friends, we'll mention a couple cards whose stock has kind of stayed neutral in my view, and the first one is one I've already mentioned repeatedly, Nihil Spellbomb. This card was good before Hogak even came around. It was good during the brief heyday of Hogak, and it will be good after Hogak. This is a 1 mana investment, 2 mana at most. You can split it up over 2 turns, and it's going to be a one-sided graveyard hoser that replaces itself and puts artifact card type into the graveyard to make our Tarmogoyfs even beefier. What more do you want? This is the type of value-oriented card that is tailor-made for Golgari Midrange, and yeah, like I said, it was good before Hogak, it was good against Hogak, and it's going to be good after Hogak is but a distant memory. So Spellbomb is still something to keep around, and the other one I'll mention here is Ashiok Dreamrender. Now, I was almost tempted to put Ashiok in the first category of cards whose stock has risen, but I don't know if that's true. But maybe it is just simply because it's way too slow to tangle against Hogak. But then again, it's kind of always been slow against any graveyard deck ever since it's been printed. The way I see Ashiok, and I tested this card for like the entire month of May on this channel and just like never ever saw it. So as this is limited data, the card was just extremely camera shy, as many of you may remember. But here's how I see Ashiok. I see Ashiok as a card that's like, okay, if you're on the fence, do I want to play 3 copies of Graveyard Hate in my sideboard, or do I want to play 4? I'm kind of torn. I kind of like think like 3.5 is almost the optimal number. Maybe Ashiok is the card for you because it is supplementary Graveyard Hate, and if you activate Ashiok repeatedly, that's pretty good. That's pretty good Graveyard Hate. The problem is it's just very slow. So if you're kind of on the fence, Ashiok is kind of like half Graveyard Hate and half hate based on the passive ability. This card slam dunks against Valakut decks. It is very, very good against Amulet Titan. It's got some other applications as well, but specifically against a very bad matchup for us, Titan Shift, Ashiok Dreamrender is a real problem for them, a real must-answer card. So Ashiok is kind of a compromise card. You can say, okay, this is supplementary Graveyard Hate. It's powerful but slow in that role, but so it's not replacing like Spellbombs and Surgicals directly. Not really even competing with them directly. It supplements them, and it also does a lot of work in a couple other prominent matchups, and, can make up the numbers in some remaining matchups as well. So Ashiok, a little bit of a mysterious card, a little bit of a difficult card to accurately rate, but more playable now, probably, I would say, than it was during the heyday of Hogvine. Alright, my friends, so that was the video. I look forward to your thoughts, on everything I said, and even perhaps on things I didn't say. If there's a point you'd like to make the broader community aware of, or if you'd like my thoughts on, feel free to leave it in the comments below. And Bridge from Below is no longer with us. It's a little bit sad to see such a cool card, even though it's a real pain to play against. No denying that it's a cool card, We got the future-shifted frame. We got just the totally bizarre rules text where it doesn't actually do anything at all if it's on the battlefield, but it does some really unique stuff if it's in the graveyard. It's even got 2 artists, right? How often do you see that? So it's a real unique card. It's a bit of a shame, in a way, to see it go by the wayside, because I love the old cards. I know a lot of you do too, but something had to go, something had to give, and they decided to make the 12-year-old card go to the dustbin of Modern's history rather than one of the ones they just printed in the first ever Modern Horizons set. So who can blame them for that, I guess. But either way, bye-bye Bridge from Below. And we'll have to see how we do. I'm overall happy with this change. I'm optimistic about our position in the meta as, Hogak fades into memory and we see how the meta takes shape. If I'm right about what I expect to happen, I think our position is going to be just fine. So remember, my friends, we've always got more gameplay coming up on this channel. I'm going to play another Golgari League very, very soon, the first ever post-ban league on this channel, and then we've got more donation leagues coming up. We've got another Jund list lined up, and we've got a Sultai Snow list, both of coming your way this month, and then maybe a little bit more. We'll have to see what else. But as always, you can expect lots and lots of BGX content here. So thanks again to all Patreon supporters. Thanks to all of you who have subscribed to the channel. We have hit 1,000 subs as of a couple days ago. That is huge. That is awesome. Thanks to everybody supporting this content in any way you can. What more can I say? I really appreciate it, and I hope you found this video valuable, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on all of the changes that I just mentioned here. I will talk to you soon. Hope you have a wonderful day.